Tokyo Ghoul tells the story of Ken Kaneki, a college student who goes out on a date with a cute girl named Rize. However, the end of the date goes poorly as Rize turns out to be a ghoul, a humanoid creature that feeds off of humans to survive and can manipulate what is called a kagune. After a fortunate accident for Kaneki, he ends up in the hospital, totally okay after the attack, except for the fact that he is now turned into a ghoul. Kaneki having his entire life flipped around, as he can now no longer live as a human being, but he is forced to live as a ghoul. Tokyo Ghoul was the series that I watched when I was at the peak of my edgy teenage phase. Maybe I'm still living out that phase in my early 20s, but for some reason I just can't escape Tokyo Ghoul. And in this video, I want to explore what makes it so damn special. Firstly, Tokyo Ghoul captures edginess in a pretty fantastic way, from the beautiful and artsy designs of the characters and their kagune, to the masks that the ghouls wear to hide their identities. But most of all, the violence of the series is perfect for that teenage audience who just realizes that mature shows exist. The key for Tokyo Ghoul is that the violence and edginess is not a gimmick, but motivated storytelling that deepens the series' perspective on how we shape our identities. Tokyo Ghoul is very much a story about how we form our identities, and things such as how trauma can affect how we perceive ourselves. I have talked many times on this channel about the way I view trauma as the moment in your life when your story that you are always telling yourself about yourself ceases to be persuasive. And Tokyo Ghoul is a story full of characters who have yet to come to terms with their own traumas, inviting many different readings into the world of Tokyo Ghoul, ranging from cultivating your identity as you move into adulthood, and the repression that comes from abuse that you may have suffered in your past. And I don't think it's an understatement to suggest that every character in Tokyo Ghoul has some kind of tortured past that they are working through. But we don't see all of that from the start. First, we get a more focused view on Kaneki's perspective before the story pulls back as time moves forward. Everything in Tokyo Ghoul starts out pretty black and white. Kaneki at first has very little knowledge about the ghouls that are everywhere in his city, and soon after he becomes a ghoul himself, Kaneki comes to the very obvious conclusion we do. Ghouls are not inherently evil, and there should be a way for them to live peacefully with humans. That is expressed early in the story when Kaneki fights Amon for the first time. Amon suffers from his own trauma in the form of a ghoul priest who eats everyone at the orphanage that he grew up in. Kaneki refuses to fight Amon to try and show that humans and ghouls should be able to live together. I find this moment in particular to be heartbreaking, but also very telling of what it is like to first start shaping your own opinions of the world, and think that solutions are far easier than they really are. For many of us, when we first start thinking critically as a late teenager, we realize that the solutions to the hate in the world should be easy, but very quickly we come to the reality that they might never be solved. This sets Kaneki down a path that will be filled with tragedy. And on the note of tragedy, characters in Tokyo Ghoul are obsessed with their role in the story. Is Kaneki a tragic hero, or is he even a hero at all? Characters are constantly talking about how their lives fit into a narrative, which reinforces how trauma manifests itself through stories. Take Mutsuki, for example. Mutsuki is introduced into the story at the beginning of Tokyo Ghoul Re as a Quinks investigator. Mutsuki and the other members of the Qs underwent a project to give them ghoul-like abilities so they can manipulate a kagune in their work of hunting down ghouls. The only thing that keeps a person like Mutsuki classified as a human and not a ghoul is the amount of RC cells that they are exposed to. So Mutsuki works as a Q investigator under Heisei Sasaki, the version of Kaneki at the start of Re. Mutsuki has multiple layers of trauma and repression in her life that make her one of the most tragic characters in the entire story. Mutsuki from a young age was abused by her family, and eventually broke, killing all of her family, but blaming it on ghouls. Years later, Mutsuki believes that ghouls are the ones who killed her parents, showing the repression she has going on in her subconscious. Mutsuki buries her murderous tendencies and puts on her shy persona that we see at the start of Re. In a way echoing Kaneki as well, they both have a type of Jekyll and Hyde relationship towards one another, and have come to the reality that both of those sides harbor the same body and are in fact the same person. The repressed murderous side of Mutsuki only comes out in small moments where she might harm a small animal to keep those tendencies alive. But everything awakens, and her hide comes to life when she is captured by the Torso Ghoul, who has become obsessed with her. Mutsuki having her repressed trauma come to the forefront with the torture of Torso. Torso, another character who was beaten and broken, moving the cycle of trauma along. A cycle that can be so tough to break out of. After Mutsuki's torture at the hand of Torso, she ends up killing him and going on a rampage for the rest of the series. Mutsuki finding a twisted love for Kaneki, the first real person to accept Mutsuki for who they were. Mutsuki becoming convinced that they are in fact in love with Kaneki, pushing Mutsuki to do terrible things to Toka and other people that Kaneki cares about. Mutsuki going wild until Yuri and Sayako step in and show how much they care for them. That is one of the more harrowing character journeys in all of Tokyo Ghoul, but shows how all of these characters have some type of trauma that they have failed to come to terms with the poor mental state of the characters in the manga being beautifully shown through the paneling. This is one of the aspects of the anime that really fell flat as an adaptation. The scratchy and often horrifying imagery of the manga adds to the mental torture that these characters are going through, with many of these characters bleeding into other panels and moments on the page, giving off this feeling that they are a person fading into multiple different places. The duality of the characters being highlighted easily through the page layouts of the manga. And the blending of characters into other backgrounds fuels the emotional outbursts of the fights. Many of the conflicts in Tokyo Ghoul are not focused on clear choreography, but by the emotions and mental states of the characters, resulting in these quick but brutal conflicts, giving the fights of the story this brutal feeling to them, that the fights are a representation of the tortured minds that are participating in them. There are so many different readings into this story that I have found it hard to locate which ones I want to explore in this very video. But one of the ideas that resonated with me so well was Tokyo Ghoul's viewpoint on minorities. Many stories tackle what it is like to be an outsider in life. That is a very commonplace, especially for an edgy series like Tokyo Ghoul. But Tokyo Ghoul adds a unique perspective and twist to that idea. At the start of the series, Kaneki and Hide know very little about ghouls, to the point that they are almost a myth, many people just flat out not believing that they exist. And for a human being who is in the majority, Kaneki doesn't need to think about what ghouls are doing or what the struggles of the ghouls are, resulting in Kaneki not even believing that they are real. But quickly after Kaneki is turned into a ghoul, he learns about how much discrimination and how difficult it is to be a ghoul, something that Kaneki didn't even believe could be possible just a short time before this. For Kaneki, there is only one thing about him that is different: what he eats, which I know is people, but just hear me out. Other than that one aspect, Kaneki is the exact same person he was previously, and right after the transformation, Kaneki only learns violence to be able to survive, not because he is a violent person. Kaneki is the same as anyone else, but his identity is now defined as a ghoul, just like a member of a minority is the same person as a person of the majority, but they are defined by that one trait. To explore this further, let's take a queer reading into the text. Gender is a constant subject throughout the course of Tokyo Ghoul. Mutsuki is a prime example of a character who struggles with their gender and is gender fluid throughout the course of the story. Big Mama is also another example of struggling with your own gender, shown when you get the panel of Suzuya saying, "Goodbye, father." Even for a character like Kaneki, who doesn't struggle to identify his gender, but struggles to come out as a ghoul to Hide. At the end of the story, we get a view into how similar Kaneki and Hide actually are, even though Kaneki is now a ghoul, beautifully shown through Kaneki's mask and the scar that Hide has at the end of the series. Tokyo Ghoul raises the question, essentially the same or essentially different? Are ghouls essentially the same as humans, or are they essentially different? I think very clearly throughout Tokyo Ghoul, you see that they are in fact the same, with the only essential difference being that ghouls have to worry about who they are, and humans do not. Ghouls do not have the privilege to ignore who they are. They have to face that reality every single day, something that can be applied to many different minority groups in life. So now that we have explored the deep amount of avenues that Tokyo Ghoul explores, ranging from how traumas function to what it is like to be a part of a minority, I want to take one last look at the king himself, Kaneki. I would be lying if I didn't bring up that Kaneki is one of my favorite characters of all time, and I think he is a huge reason why Tokyo Ghoul works as well as it does. Kaneki literally becomes a different character at many points throughout the story, evolving from Kaneki to white-haired Kaneki to Heisei Sasaki, and then the One-Eyed King. These different forms not only punctuate how you can look at a younger version of yourself and not even recognize who you used to be, but also how through it all there is still a layer that is no doubt you, even through all of the trauma Kaneki has gone through. No matter which version of Kaneki we see, the shield and walls that he may put up still leak out similar tendencies, and this is shown through his love of reading. Again, characters are obsessed with stories throughout this series, which shows the importance of how stories function in our identity. Building our identities is one of the most difficult things we can possibly do because of the outside pressures of so many other people. As we go further and further into a world where it at least seems that you can achieve anything you want, the pressure to choose the thing that you were born to do grows exponentially. And the identities that we form also take a harder turn when you take into account how people from minorities have to code things like their language to appease the majority. Even for someone like me, a person who has been involved in many different social groups in my life, ranging from pure weebs to jocks at school, as I had to put on a mask everywhere I went, making me feel like I wasn't actually a person, but something different, an entity that would just stay in the background trying to please the people around me, trying not to stand out, with my true self never being revealed. In Tokyo Ghoul, the characters are constantly blending into the surrounding panels on the page, bleeding into the background, at times having trouble identifying who they are. Another signal to the struggle of identity that floods this series. Tokyo Ghoul being a series full of deeply traumatic and broken characters who struggle with placing themselves in the world. And when I stumbled across this series in the depths of my own identity crisis, it showed me a path that I could take. Even through all of the difficulty that these characters go through, They keep moving forward even when things get hard, and eventually the repressed nature of their trauma comes to surface, and they must face the reality of their life and face their story head on. And the end of Tokyo Ghoul takes all of these people who have been struggling and gives a conclusion that looks at trauma in a slightly different way. In the end, we can't erase the traumas of our lives, those traumas often being the reason that we struggle so heavily to form our identity in a world that expects us to have it defined early in our lives. The more that we try to repress these feelings and hardships, the more violently they will rise to the top. So the difficulty of overcoming the trauma is saying that it is okay, and that we will take steps to conquering this moment than trying to forget that it ever existed. For someone like Mutsuki, she needed her friends to say that we are with you, and we don't care what you have gone through. For Amon, he still holds the days in the orphanage in high esteem, even though they ended in tragedy. And Kaneki being turned into a ghoul and forcing him to become a savior that he is not, finds happiness in Hide and Toka and the people around him. Tokyo Ghoul deepening our understanding of how we should approach our identities in this world, and really showing us how hard so many different aspects of life can be. A message that reaches to all ages of people, and one that only hits me harder the older I get. Tokyo Ghoul being a series that I will come back to again and again to experience this great story.